This is day 23 and day 24 of the Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard defamation trial. Let's talk about it. Hey everyone, welcome to Legalbytes. If you're new here, my name is Alita. I'm a lawyer licensed in California and DC, and on this channel, we explain the law one bite at a time. So first off, my massive apologies in getting this video out so late. This, of course, is a massive project that we decided to undertake on this channel by live streaming every single day of this trial and by doing daily recaps on top of it. And I sincerely appreciate all the patience from all of you viewers that have been kindly waiting for to watch this video. Anyhow, because day 23 and day 24 were both kind of shortened days, I decided to compile them into one video. Day 24 was, of course, closing arguments, and it started jury deliberations. And day 23, we heard the very last of the witnesses in this trial. First, we heard from Dr. Richard Gilbert. He was the final rebuttal witness for Johnny Depp. Then we heard from Julian Ackert, Dr. Dawn Hughes, and Amber Heard herself for her rebuttal testimony. So let's start with day 23. On day 23, first off, we heard from Dr. Richard Gilbert. Dr. Gilbert is an orthopedic surgeon and was a witness for Johnny Depp. Dr. Richard Gilbert testified that the Australia incident, which resulted in Johnny's finger being essentially cut off, was most likely due to a high velocity of force or crush injury. He said that this was due to the fact that the fracture has multiple fragments, and he said that a vodka bottle can crush the finger, break, and lacerate the tissue. When asked whether the injury could be from punching an item or slamming an item such as a telephone, he testified that the injury is likely not to have happened that way because if he were holding some kind of a fist, the injury would be generally to the knuckles as opposed to the fingertip. And if there had been some kind of an injury to the fingertip through some form of a punch or some sort of a slamming action with a phone, you would expect to see an injury to the nail bed in addition to the sort of fracturing that we saw on the tip of the finger. Another reason why he pointed to as to why this likely wasn't some sort of a punch or a slam is because of the fact that there's no bruising elsewhere on the hand or on the fingers other than where the fingertip was essentially lopped off. And he said that this makes a punch or a slam less likely. Anyhow, after Dr. Gilbert testified, Johnny Depp rested his whole case in chief. Next up was Amber Heard's rebuttal witnesses for her case in chief. The first one was Julian Ackert. Mr. Ackert testified as an expert witness on metadata issues. And so he testified as to the authenticity of her photos. And although he said that he couldn't testify as to all of Amber's photos to say if they were authentic, he said that the photos that were selected by Mr. Neumeister, Johnny Depp's expert, he said that he could testify that all of those specifically were authentic using his expert analysis. He also testified that while Amber produced multiple versions of the same photo, he essentially pointed to the use of the Photos app on her iPhone, which he said is a sorting and editing app. However, on cross-examination, Mr. Dennison from Johnny Depp's legal team brought forward Exhibits 712 and 713. Mr. Dennison asked Mr. Ackert to testify as to whether or not those photos look different. And Mr. Ackert said that visually, they do look different. Mr. Dennison then showed the same photos with the basic metadata photo showing the date, hour, and location of the photos as they were created, as well as the file name. And he had him testify as to whether those photos had the exact same date, hour, location, and file names. Spoiler alert, they did. So in other words, Mr. Ackert admitted that these two photos, which look very different, were created at the exact same time, both date and time, and at the same location, and that they even had the same exact file name. Although Mr. Ackert reasoned that there was further metadata behind this photo that wasn't being shown on the screen that could be analyzed to show whether or not this was authentic, nonetheless, that is pretty damaging, I'm not gonna lie. Anyhow, next up was Dr. Dawn Hughes, who was, of course, rebutting Dr. Curry's testimony from the day before. Essentially, Dr. Hughes' testimony from day 23 could be chalked up to everything Dr. Curry said is wrong. Dr. Curry isn't quite qualified to do the tests that she did or that Dr. Hughes did, and that essentially Dr. Hughes ran all of the tests on Amber Heard properly and got exactly the correct results that she should have gotten. And also, by the way, that Dr. Hughes has been doing this day in and day out for 25 years. Most of these arguments are not exactly compelling, and in the face of the logic that Dr. Curry employed for the jury, this is not exactly the most compelling testimony. On top of that, on cross-examination, Mr. Dennison actually did a fair job on cross-examining her, much better than the job he did previously with Dr. Hughes. For one thing, he turned to the National Center for PTSD's guidelines on how to administer one of the tests that she gave Amber Heard to determine whether or not she had PTSD, which is the PCL5. The guidelines, of course, said that the test is not supposed to be determinative for a diagnosis. Dr. Hughes argued back with Mr. Dennison that the PCL5 was not the only test that she used to diagnose Amber, which is why Mr. Dennison actually turned to another test, the CTS2. As far as the CTS2 goes, Mr. Dennison pointed out how the test is supposed to be administered to ask as for PTSD and the cause of PTSD within the last year. And he pointed out that in Amber Heard's case that her PTSD allegedly started more than a year prior to her discussions with Dr. Hughes. Dr. Hughes responded to Mr. Dennison by saying that that's why she extended the test to ask for information beyond a year prior to this. But Mr. Dennison's point is the test is not intended to go beyond a year before that time. Anyhow, then Mr. Dennison also went through the standardized test with all kinds of boxes and forms and things that Dr. Hughes did not quite fill in completely, and basically to suggest for the jury that she did things rather hastily. She did things so that she would create a particular conclusion, not quite based on data, but that she would find the data to fill a particular conclusion. Anyhow, then we somehow, for some reason, heard from Amber Heard. This was a bit of a surprise. I was not expecting to hear from her because of the fact that hearing from her again at this juncture would undoubtedly be a disaster for Amber Heard's team. And on day 22, those of us on the panel on this channel actually were fairly critical of the fact that Johnny Depp was put back on the stand for rebuttal testimony. We figured that he likely had nothing to be gained from going up there, but as it turns out, that could have very well been a very strong strategic play to essentially provoke Amber Heard to have the last word here. And essentially, that's what happened. She was asked initially, how has this whole case affected you? She talked about how she's had all kinds of emotional harm. She talked about how she says that the world is hating her, how she says that people want to unalive her. She says that people want to put her baby in a microwave, all kinds of things that, like, realistically would be very sympathetic, if not for the way in which she is playing to normal human beings. She talked about harassment, humiliation, trauma, damage done to her, unspoken rules for how people are supposed to talk to her and to touch her, people meaning her closest friends and family members. Unfortunately, this emotional appeal didn't exactly work, although the things that she was saying were actually quite sympathetic. And what's more, her case was actually quite limited in rebuttal testimony time. And on the other side, Johnny Depp's team had about 6 hours of time left that they could use on her cross-examination. And so when Camille Vasquez came up to do the cross-examination, she was able to fully employ a very long cross-examination and effectively reopen all of the doors that she was able to open previously on her initial cross-examination. This allowed Camille to go through the kitchen video of TMZ and to ask her about how Morgan Tremaine from TMZ had testified that a 15-minute upload and publishing of the video after receipt could only happen when it comes from the original source, and how this was in fact a 15-minute upload for TMZ. Basically, she accused Amber of leaking that video to TMZ, and the logic that she was employing was actually quite strong, and Amber's responses were not that great. It also allowed Camille to admit a new photo of the day after the DVTRO hearing in May 2016. This photo is of her and Rocky Pennington laughing in the sun, and it looks like she's not wearing any makeup, and it looks like she has no bruises on her face. Further allowed Camille to bring up the 2 different wine floor photos that looked identical, and it gave Camille the opportunity to say which one of these is from December 15th, 2015, and which one is from May 21st, 2016. Amber tried to argue back, it's impossible for me to know without looking at the metadata, and Camille was able to say, how could you not know which one is from which? And although Amber tried to play it off as a normal human thing to forget which one would be from which, the obvious question in the room, or the obvious answer in the room rather, was the fact that these are exactly the same photo, and at least one of them was being improperly misapplied to a particular date. Camille is then also able to just go through a long list of witnesses and basically say, so this person lied, right? And that person lied, right? And that person lied, right? It was very, very damaging to Amber's testimony. And she even got Amber to say on the stand, that was why I wrote the op-ed article about Johnny. Although it hasn't exactly been fought by Amber Heard's team that Amber wrote the op-ed article, there's been an argument about the title of the article, or at least the online version of it. The article itself has never exactly been an argument as to whether or not she wrote it. However, there has been an argument by her team that the article was not about Johnny. The article was about the Me Too movement. But this very last day of testimony, this very last moment of testimony, Amber essentially admitted, not essentially, she did admit, you could hear the words coming right out of her mouth saying, that's why I wrote the op-ed about Johnny, is because I had to speak out about these institutions protecting these powerful men. Anyhow, so that's day 23. Let's talk about closing arguments. So before we talk about the closing arguments in this case, let's talk about closing arguments generally. Now, it's often the case that jurors will make a decision much earlier on in the case, but the closing argument is the last chance to make a case and to win the jury over. Now, keep in mind that good evidence will always trump a good closing argument. And the first draft of a closing argument gets drafted long before the trial ever begins because it gets constructed from the overall theory of the case, which the attorneys outlined in the opening statement. Ideally, there should be some kind of thematic parallels between the opening statement and the closing argument. Although the attorneys are not beholden to replicate all aspects of the opening statement, because often what comes out at trial isn't exactly what the attorneys expected or hoped for, the closing argument still has to be relatively tracking for the overall theory nonetheless. But here are a couple of things to look for in a good closing argument. One of them is to have the same theory of the case. If that has changed somehow through trial, there are some major problems for that particular legal team. One of the other things is to have the same sort of theme or buzzwords. And again, this really shouldn't differ too much from the opening statement. And keep in mind that the main purpose of a closing argument is to take the evidence that the jury has seen and to put it together into a neat package. The task is to give the jurors both logical and emotional reasons to find in the party's favor. Think of it this way. The trial is essentially like an IKEA bookshelf. In the opening statements, the attorneys are essentially scanning through the instructions from start to finish to see how things should end up. The witness testimony throughout the trial is essentially where the attorneys are taking out all the pieces from the box. The screws, the knobs, the slabs of wood, and arranging them into clusters and organizing them in such a way so that eventually you can kind of start to see how things might lay out. Then in the closing argument, the attorneys are essentially putting the pieces together so that the instructions become a physical bookshelf that exists in the real world. Now, one thing to note is that a closing argument doesn't have any sort of standardization to it. It is pure persuasion. One of the best recommendations for any good closing argument is for the attorney to lead from their strengths, whatever those may be. Be yourself, essentially, because this is one of the most uniquely personal parts of the trial for the lawyer. And so sometimes a good closing argument can depend much more on how effectively the advocate's personality is projected towards the jurors than upon any sort of single factor. And so the success of a closing argument can often depend much more on how effectively the advocate's personality is projected towards the jurors than upon any sort of single factor. If the attorney is a passionate person, showing emotion is exactly the route to go. If the attorney is much more of a quiet person, showing some sort of quiet intensity will probably do the trick. And in terms of who they are trying to persuade, essentially the goal is for the attorney to find whatever jurors on that panel might be their biggest supporters and to arm them with as much ammunition as they can so that they can go into the jury deliberation room and essentially finish the work of the attorney by persuading all of the other jurors to their position. Now, one last thing before we get into the actual closing arguments that happen in this case. Objections are a good question. Can the attorneys object to one another? And the answer to that is yes, but the attorneys have to tread carefully. Generally speaking, an attorney that is objecting to the other side really should not object unless they really think that what they are saying is going to be a winning objection. It's because disrupting another attorney's flow in their closing argument can be considered quite rude, and so it really should be left only to where it is absolutely essential, because the other attorney who is doing their closing argument actually is doing something really improper. Okay, so let's talk about the closing arguments in this particular case. So as I mentioned, generally speaking, you want to have the same sort of theme, same sort of buzzwords crossing over from the opening statements to the closing arguments on both sides. And if you remember from Johnny Depp's opening statements, their legal team had these themes, these buzzwords of Amber Heard being particularly dramatic, particularly exaggerative. Well, when that came around to the closing arguments, that theme wasn't exactly replicated, but it was amplified. She was no longer dramatic and exaggerative, but she was a liar. Both Camille, who did the first part of the closing argument, and Ben Shu, who did the second part of the closing argument, both of them relayed throughout their themes the lies that Amber has told. And so essentially what they hammered into the jury was that it wasn't exactly Amber Heard versus Johnny Depp, but it was Amber Heard versus Johnny Depp and Isaac Baruch and Alejandro Romero and Morgan Tremaine and the police officers and all of the other witnesses, essentially. She basically was able to, Camille, was basically able to use all of the witnesses, almost, just about, in order to testify for Johnny's case in chief. And one of the things that I really liked about their closing arguments was the way in which they threaded throughout the closing arguments the various pieces of audio that were very damaging to Amber's case. For example, the one where Amber says, "Tell the world, Johnny." One of the most compelling ones was the first one that they used to thread that needle. Then, of course, they used the audio where she admitted to hitting the door on his head because she was angry or reacting to the fact that her toe or foot had been hurt from the bottom of the door. And of course, they played that bit of audio where she says, "I was hitting you, I was not punching you." They talked about her BPD diagnosis. They talked about her fear of abandonment and how that turned her into a very angry, explosive, aggressive, violent, cruel person. They talked about how she would rather fight than let him leave her. They talked about how this resulted in the vodka bottle and the finger incident. They played her audio where she was cackling on that particular audio. That one that is so terrifying to listen to. And they basically said that she never admits to doing anything wrong. They talked about her version of donating versus pledging. And they played the audio, or the video clip rather, of the Dutch TV show where she says that she actually donated all $7 million of her money. Camille even used Amber's acting coach to say that Amber had difficulty crying when acting. Camille never quite went that full step to say that obviously this means that Amber was lying on the stand to them, but it was just to point out, to remind the jury that this was an issue for her and that there, in fact, were no tears from Amber on that stand, despite how emotional she was when she was giving that testimony. Anyhow, that was essentially the closing arguments from Johnny Depp's team. In Amber Heard's team, the themes and the buzzwords were basically down to the freedom of speech, First Amendment kind of argument. Although in the opening statements, this definitely was a theme, there was also an additional theme that was in the opening statements, which seemed to have been dropped in the closing arguments, which is this idea that Johnny Depp was a monster. Although Ben Rottenborn and Elaine Bredehoft definitely brought up the evidence that they had to try to suggest Johnny Depp being a monster, they didn't repeat that word throughout the closing argument in the same way that they had during the opening statement. And this is very interesting because whereas Johnny Depp's team had essentially a ramp up of the intensity of their theme, Amber Heard's team had a little bit of the opposite. It was almost as if they were kind of backtracking from their initial intensity, which to me doesn't exactly look that good. It looks like they are ending much less powerfully than where they started. And because of the fact that the closing argument is based off of evidence that has come out at trial, it's not exactly the best look when your closing argument based on evidence seems to be weaker than your opening statement, which is where you're making all of these promises. Anyhow, the things that were touched on in the closing argument were things like the argument that Amber Heard did not write the headline of the online article. They also said that Johnny Depp asserted coercive control and that there was a power imbalance between the two. Then they also did some work to thread some of the audio that came out at trial to thread throughout the closing argument as well. That said, the audio that was ultimately used here did not exactly feel particularly damaging to Johnny. For example, there was the one where Johnny is very audibly moaning. It sounds like either he's on a plane or he's in some area that has a very large fan on, but either way, he's clearly in some kind of agony. And the connection between that audio and where exactly it took place was never really clear from Amber Heard's team. So it just felt like it was just a very embarrassing moment to be played for Johnny Depp on the stand. And anyhow, that was the most jarring bit of audio that was played during the closing argument, arguably. But like I said, it wasn't exactly that effective, unlike what happened during Johnny Depp's closing arguments, where all of those audio tapes were very damaging for Amber Heard's case. Now, another bit of media that was played, of course, was the kitchen video scene where Johnny Depp was slamming some cabinet doors and whatnot, and then he got upset for being filmed. And I was actually almost expecting for them to try to play the incomplete video where it just ends with Johnny finding the video and it sort of scrambling and going black on the screen and then cutting off there, the TMZ version of the video. However, to their credit, they did play the entire thing, probably because it would have gotten vehemently objected to by the other side. Now, another thing that happened across the board between the two sides in closing arguments was the objections. Now, if you remember, what I said was objections are totally possible during closing arguments, but they have to be done very judiciously. And on both sides, they had multiple objections. The first objections were brought by Ben Rottenborn against Ben Chew. And those objections came about while Ben Chew was talking about Kate Moss and saying that she testified that Amber Heard lied about the stairs rumor. Rottenborn objected, asked to approach the judge. They came back, and Ben Chew continued with his testimony, which indicated that he probably won on that objection. He basically said the same thing. Then Rottenborn objected again, arguing from his chair rather than approaching the judge by saying he's misstating testimony. Right after Ben Chew said that Amber Heard lied about Kate Moss on the stand, Rottenborn's objection was that he was misstating testimony. And Judge Oscarati's response was overruled, essentially saying he's not misstating testimony that Amber Heard lied. There was testimony that Amber Heard lied. This is a particularly damaging kind of objection to be overruled on in front of the jury, especially when you are making that speaking objection in front of the jury and you don't have to. You can just approach the judge again immediately thereafter. Anyhow, the other set of objections was Ben Chew against Elaine Bredehoff's portion of their closing argument. What was interesting about that was that she previously was already saying some things in her closing argument that appeared to be misstatements of fact and law. For example, she said that Adam Waldman going to newspapers to say that Amber Heard was under perjury investigations by the LAPD was actual malice. Legitimately, that probably actually is quite the misstatement of what actual malice actually is. Anyhow, that wasn't even something that Ben Chew objected to, although he legitimately probably could have. What he did object to, however, was when Elaine Bredehoff said that Adam Waldman was planting information across all sorts of places about the makeup issues, saying that she had made it look like she had bruises on her face. That immediately drew an objection from Ben Chew, who asked to approach. And so we don't know exactly what the objection was. We don't know exactly what the back and forth was between the two parties. However, once they sat down, she turned to the jury and said, "I'm not saying that any witnesses testified that Adam Waldman planted any of this stuff anywhere. I'm arguing myself, that's my opinion, that that's what happened, since she didn't have a stitch of makeup on in all of these other photos where you can see her bruises." Now, arguably, that also could have and maybe should have drawn an objection as well, because she's testifying to facts not in evidence, or arguing from facts not in evidence. However, the fact that he had just objected was probably enough to alert the jury that what she was saying right there was total BS. Now, the other part where Ben Chew objected to Elaine Bredehoff's closing argument was where she started to argue about the divorce settlement, saying that she was entitled to half of his income because California was a no-fault state. Ben Chew objected. They approached. We don't know what the exact objection was or what the back and forth was between the two parties. But when she came down, she essentially moved on. So it seems like Ben Chew, although had some multiple opportunities to object where he didn't, it was probably a good idea that he didn't object in other instances, and where he did choose to do so, it looked like he was successful. Anyhow, but that's the recap on day 23 and day 24. But what do you think? Did you watch the testimony and the closing arguments in this case? If so, let us know your thoughts down in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you found this interesting or at least informative. And if you did, I would love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you haven't done so already, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next video is uploaded, and so you can join us while we do the verdict watch for this case all the way up until the jury comes back with a verdict as to whether or not Johnny Depp or Amber Heard is right here on this channel. We'll be live streaming all the way up until that moment. See you in the next video.